begin in Mirz Hashem, the eighth parak, Perka Isha. And what we've already learned is that the Pesach has to be brought liminuyov, and the people have to register on the Korban Pesach. And this is derived from the pasuk Ish ki yachosu al aseh, and b'mechsas nefashos ish lefi achlo tachusu al aseh. So the Mishnah says, Isha, a woman who is obligated, according to the Gemara later on in Korban Pesach, is man shehi bebeis baila, if she's married, shochet oleh baila v'shochet oleh avia, both her father and her husband in this case, both shechted on her behalf, the Korban Pesach. And the assumption is that she would agree to be registered on one of these two, we don't know which one, or v'shachet oleh avia, tochal mishal baila. In this case, she's considered manui on the Korban Pesach of her husband. And this is based on an umdana. This is we call it circumstantial evidence. We assume that a woman would want to eat the Korban Pesach with her husband rather than with her father. Holcha regel rishon lasos bebeis avia. Apparently, it was custom in those days, and even in our day to some extent, that a woman in her first year of marriage will go to spend Pesach with her father in her father's house. He apparently was still eating in his own house together with his cohorts, his colleagues. And now, v'shochet oleh avia v'shochet oleh baila, again the same scenario, both her husband and her father shechted Korban Pesach on her behalf. Tochal b'makom she rotza. She'll decide at some point, the Gemara is going to discuss at what point in time she makes this decision, which Korban Pesach she will be part of. Normally, we assume, if it's not the first year of marriage, that a woman wants to eat the Korban Pesach with her husband. But in this particular scenario, first year of marriage, and she's spending Yontif with her father, there's a very good chance that she would want to eat the Korban Pesach that her father had designated on her behalf. And the Mishnah again repeats, Tochal b'makom shehi rotza, she'll decide where she wants to eat. And as we said before, we don't know exactly at what point in time she'll make that decision. Is it at the moment of the shechita? Is it later on when they're ready to eat the Korban Pesach? She'll decide. And the fact that it's the first year marriage tips the scale a little bit. Before it was, let's say, 80 versus 20 that she would want to eat with her husband. That's during the course of the marriage. But now it's 50-50. We don't know. We cannot guess as to which Korban Pesach she wants to eat from. She'll make that decision. The Mishnah continues, Yasom. Here's a case of a young orphan, unfortunately, has two apotropsim who are designated to oversee all of his financial matters and affairs. And shachtu olav apotropsim. And both of these two apotropsim, each one respectively, shechted the Korban Pesach on behalf of their common client at Yosam. Yochel b'makom shu rotze. The Yosam will, again, at some point, we don't know exactly when, but he'll make the decision which Korban Pesach he wants to be part of. The Mishnah continues. Eved shel shnei shutfim, lo yochal mishel shneim. If an Eved, we're talking about an Eved Knani now, and he has the status of an Isha as far as halach is concerned, and as a result of his gerus, when he enters into the state of Avdus, he is now obligated in the mitzvah Korban Pesach, and he is owned in joint partnership by two owners. Each one brought the Korban Pesach with him in mind, and they designated him. Is in this case, the Mishnah surprises us and tells us, Lo yochal mishel shneim. He won't be able to eat neither from this Korban Pesach nor from the other. And again, even though in previous cases where we had a doubt which one he would choose, we threw the ball in his court or in her court, and in this case, there's no such thing. If an Eved was owned by joint ownership, and one of the two owners he released the Eved of his half of the ownership, he's left with half of the ownership to the other Adon, and now the other Adon brings the Korban Pesach on his behalf, that's not valid, because you cannot bring the Korban Pesach on behalf of half an Eved. And now we'll start the Gemara here on Daf Pei Zayin. The Gemara says, Shamet Mina, Yesh Brera. In the case in the Mishnah, where both her father and her husband, on the first Pesach of their marriage, had brought the Korban Pesach on her behalf, and the Mishnah says she'll decide which Korban Pesach she wants to participate in. She has two choices, her father's or her husband's. So the Gemara says that can only make sense and only be valid if I hold Yesh Brera. Yesh Brera, just in general, means that a Maisa was done at time T1, but it was undefined. And later on, the decision will be made as to how to define and fine-tune that Maisa. And we have major machlokas all of Shas, the Yesh Brera, Ein Brera. Shall we prove from our Mishnah that Yesh Brera, that her decision later on as to which Pesach she wants to sign on is going to impact the moment of Shechita when the Minui is Chal. So that at the moment of Shechita, the Minui was undetermined. Why? Because she could make a choice and we cannot anticipate one way or the other. It's the first year of their marriage, and very often she would want to eat the Korban Pesach in her father's house. So we have a 50-50 balance. Later on, the ball's in her court, she'll make that decision. And that decision will impact on the moment of Minui, which is the Shechita. So it works L'mafreya retroactively. Now, how do we know that the key of keys in order to generate Minui on a Korban Pesach is Shechita? Because the Torah says, Yachutzu alaseh. Yachutzu is a lashon of shechita. So the moment of shechita is the critical moment. We have to sketch it, edge it in stone at that moment of shechita what she wants. When she decides later which Korban Pesach she wants to be part of, l'mafreya, retroactively, it will be determined that she is part of that Korban Pesach. We hold Yesh Brera. The Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says, my rotza. What does the Mishnah mean, rotza? Meaning, at what point in time is she going to reveal her decision as to which Korban Pesach she wants to be part of? Is she manui with her husband or with her father? B'shas shechita. It doesn't say in the Mishnah exactly when she makes that decision and she pronounces which Korban Pesach she wants to be part of, and we're going to interpret it as the moment of shechita. If it's after the shechita, then she doesn't have minui on either Korban Pesach, because after shechita it's too late to become a money, and we're holding ein brera. So her decision later is not going to impact retroactively on the moment of shechita. And all this is based on one predicate, and that is that there has to be vados. At the moment of shechita, when the minui is chal, there has to be a certainty as to who is on board and who is going to be part of this minui. Now the Gemara is going to bring a brisa that contradicts our Mishnah bitarte in two ways. Uraminu, here's a brisa that says Isha beregel rishon ochels mishal avia. If it was the first Pesach of their marriage, then there's no doubt in the case where both the father and the husband set aside a Korban Pesach on her behalf, she will eat with her father's Korban Pesach. It's not even a suffix. Our Mishnah said it's up in the air and she'll make the decision as to which Pesach she wants to be part of. The Brisa continues, Ocheles Michel Avia, Umikan Vielech, in subsequent Pesachim, not the first Pesach of their marriage, then Rotz Ocheles Michel Avia, Rotz Michel Baila. She'll decide which of the two Karbanos Pesachim she wants to be part of. Again, it contradicts to our Mishnah. And Mishnah assumes, and based on that assumption is going to paskin, that she is part of her father's Korban Pesach, with the exception of the first year of marriage when it's a toss up. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, you know what? We can reconcile the Mishnah and the Brisa. B'redufa lelech, kan b'redufa lelech, kan be'ena redufa lelech. So let's go backwards. Our Mishnah is talking about a regular case. She's not a redufa. We'll explain what a redufa is in a minute. And therefore, we assume that, except for the exceptional case of the first regel of their marriage, she certainly wants to be on board with her husband. Now, what's that case of an Eina Redufa, the normal classic case of marriage? That's where she feels very comfortable in her house. Marriage, Baruch Hashem, was very successful. She's chaviva, al bailo and beisa chaviva aleh. That's fine. Then there's something called a redufa. A redufa is a woman who you see is always gravitating to her parents' house. She does not find it comfortable to be in her husband's house. That's an unfortunate situation, of course, but it happens. That's called a redufa. Redufa means she's like a victim of a marriage and she's running away, always gravitating towards her parents' house. And the nafkamina between an Eina redufa and a redufa is a double nafkamina. Number one, the Eina redufa, that's our Mishnah, we always assume during the course of their married life that she would rather be with her husband for the Korban Pesach, except for the case of the first Pesach of their marriage, where she will spend that Pesach with her father, therefore she wants to, or she might want to be part of her father's Pesach, and it's a suffix, we don't know. She'll make that decision before the Shechita, as we decided before. However, in the case of Redufa, which is addressed by the Brisa, there we're going to assume, number one, that if it's the Regel Rishon, then for sure, no doubt, she wants to eat in her father's house. That's where she's spending Pesach, and that's where she's most comfortable. During the course of the balance of their marriage, she's a Redufa, and then the halacha is that we'll have to ask her decision. She may have various considerations as to whether or not she prefers to be part of her father's Pesach or her husband's Pesach. That's going to be the case of a redufa. The Gemara now is going to quote a drasha on a pasuk in Shir Hashirim to explain this concept of a redufa, a woman who really runs to base aviyah. The pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, "T'ksiv odz hayisi beinov kimotzeis shalom." And what happens is that all of Shir Hashirim is a metaphor for the relationship between Klal Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Knesset Yisrael is called the Kala, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is called the Dod. And this pasuk is describing a beautiful relationship between the Kala and the Dod. And in this case is Kimotzeis Shalom Rav. Amar Rab Yochanan, what does this mean? Kimotzeis Shalom Rav. Kikala shenimtzeis shlema bebeis chamia. Beis chamia means at her husband's house, the house of her in-laws, and she's very comfortable in her husband's house. Baruch Hashem, it's a healthy and normal marriage. Redufa leilech lahagit shvacha bebeis avia, and she runs all the time to describe the beautiful relationship that they have. She's so proud that she runs to her father and tells her father, "Dad, Baruch Hashem, I was zocheh to a beautiful marriage, and I'm very happy with my house, my new home with my husband." And this is all a mashal that a Jew would run to his parents to tell them, "Wow, we are the Jewish people, and we have a close relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. It's Kavosei Shalom Rav. It's so peaceful, and it's harmonious between the Almighty and Knesset Yisrael." And Rashi, by the way, seems to take out the word dichsiv, because this is not a proof really to what we said before. It's just in a sense a parallel that we find the concept of a redufa within the context of marriage. Again, the redufa here in the concept of marriage is a result of the chavivus of the marriage. We were talking in our sugya here in Pesachim about the redufa that's indicative of just the opposite. Now the Gemara quotes a different drasha of Rabbi Yochanan, the same Rabbi Yochanan, on a pasuk in Hosea Hanavi. V'haya bayom hahu nu'um Hashem tikri'i ishi v'lo tikri'i li od ba'ali. The Navi is giving us a prediction, a vision of what's going to be at the end of days, bayom hahu. And we're going to have a relationship between Knesset Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is ishi. Ishi, the word ishi here in context of a contradiction, of a conflict or a contrast, I should say, with Baali is a full marriage, as opposed to Baali, which is a technical marriage. Like, for example, Erisin. Technically, they're married. She's an HC, but it's not Nisuin. She's not living with her husband. But by Yom Ahu, what's going to be the relationship between the Chas and the Kala, between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan Kekala v'Beis Chamia, and Beis Chamia means in the house of her in-laws, meaning she's already married fully, and the relationship is such that she feels very comfortable in the marriage. She's not embarrassed to be with her husband. She's not jittering, sitting on shpilkas, will I say the right thing? Will I ruin the cake, and so forth and so on. And that's going to be our relationship between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not like the case of an Arutza who is still living in the house of her father. And obviously, she's a little embarrassed and uptight about being with her husband. Our relationship, Yom Ahu, will be that of a marriage relationship where we feel so comfortable in the presence of the Almighty. Continuing now, Rabbi Yochanan's drasha on the Psukim and Shir Hashirim, Achotz lanu ktana v'shadayim ein lo. So we're talking about a young girl who hasn't yet physically matured, and she cannot nurse a baby. She doesn't have the breast to nurse a baby. And in a sense, the pasuk is saying we cannot benefit from her. And this is all a mashal. On Rabbi Yochanan, this achos, in this pasuk is a metaphor to Elam. Elam is a country where Daniel, the great Daniel, lived. As it says at the beginning of Sefer Daniel, it says, "Vani b'Shushana b'Yiracher be'Elam haMedina." So Elam is a country, and the capital of that country is Shushan. I guess you'd call it Iraq today, and that's where Daniel comes from. And the pasuk is saying about Daniel that Zochsa Lilmod, Daniel certainly learned a lot of Torah. He was a great scholar, but Lo Zochsa Lilamed. He wasn't able to be Marbitz Torah in that area of the world called Elam. And this is in contrast to Bavel, because whereas in Elam he wasn't able to teach Torah, but in Bavel, the great scholars in Bavel were able to teach Torah. And the teaching the Torah is now metaphorically symbolized here by nursing. When you nurse, you give nourishment, and the Torah, when it's taught and transmitted, gives nourishment to the student, the disciple of the Torah. Pasuk says, "Ani choma v'shadai kimigdalos." Rabbi Yochanan, "Ani choma zu Torah." Choma is a security wall that surrounds the city and protects the city from attackers, and so too the Torah has the power to protect the people of Israel. It gives Haganah. V'shadai kimigdalos elu talmidei chachamim, and they are compared to shadayim, to breasts that nurse, because they nurse and transmit the Torah to others, and in so doing, they protect the entire generation, like a choma, like a wall, a security wall that surrounds the city. For Rav Amar, Rav has a slightly different twist on this pasuk, Ani choma v'shadai k'migdalos. Ani choma zu Knesset Yisrael. It means that Knesset Yisrael are very protective. They set up walls to separate them from the Ovdei Kochavim, lest they intermarry. V'shadai k'migdalos elu batei knesios u'batei midrashos. These are areas where they teach Torah publicly, and they protect the generation. Amar Rav Zutra bar Tuvia Amar Rav Maidich Siv, a pasuk in Tilim, Asher banenu kinetiim. Let me read this pasuk with its English translation, because we have a long Agadata here, so I think the English will be a little bit easier. The pasuk says the following: Asher banenu, for our sons, initiim. Nitiyim, and nitiya is a sapling that you plant in the ground. And we're comparing our boys to saplings. That's a beautiful metaphor, as we'll soon see. Megudalim binu urehem. and they are nurtured from their youth. In other words, they are brought up in a very pure chinuch environment. And what about our daughters? B'nosenu kizavios. Our daughters are like a 90-degree angle at a corner. Mechutavos. Chativa is to craft something. Avnis heichal, like the form of the temple. So this pasuk is describing in the most lofty terms the young men and the young women of Klal Yisrael. Asher banenu kinetiim, our sons are like saplings. Elu bachure Yisrael shalotamu tam chet, that they've been raised in the proper environment, and therefore they don't have any sin. They don't have any relationships with women. They are pure. And so to our daughters, kizavios, elu besulos Yisrael, she'ogdos pischeim leba'alehem. So these are the besulos of Klal Yisrael, and although they are kizavios, we'll see that the word kizavios means full, F-U-L-L, maleos in Hebrew. But nevertheless, they are loyal to their future husbands, and they don't have a relationship with any other man before getting married. So they are celibate until they engage in marital relations with their husbands. And all this has to do with the word zavis, which is interpreted here to mean maleim. They are full. We'll see exactly what the implication here of this fullness is. V'chenu omer, and now we're going to quote a pasuk in Zechariah Novi to try to prove that the word zavios, which literally means that 90-degree angle at a corner, really refers to fullness. And the pasuk says, "V'chenu omer umal'u kimizrak kizavios." They'll be filled like a bowl. A mizrak is a bowl. Even in Beis Hamikdash, the mizrak is the bowl that the Kohen receives the dam in. And malu, the key word here is malu. Malu means they're filled. Kizavios, like the corners of the mizbeach. And the corners of the mizbeach were used for the zrikas hadam, so that the altar was, so to speak, in desire for dam. And metaphorically, we are feeding the mizbeach the dam in its zavios, and the mizbeach feels full. It feels satiated. And the concept of zavios, therefore fullness, means that even if a young girl has matured, or a young boy has matured to the point at which they have full desire in the area of relations with the opposite gender, nevertheless, they are very loyal and they are very, very careful, abstaining from any sort of cohabitation. If you want to have another proof from a different pasuk to prove that the word zavitz means fullness, and it says mizavenu maleim. Again, the word mizavenu, the corners, but maleim. Here it says explicitly maleim. They're full. Mefikim mizan el zan. They provide from harvest to harvest. Now let's get back to the original pasuk, which ends with the words mechutavos tavnis heichal, crafted in the form of the heichal, the holy of the Beis Hamikdash. Elu v'elu, in other words, whether it's the young men or the young women, because of their modesty and their strict purity as young men or young women, it's as if the Torah says they had built the heichal during their days. And now the Gemara goes on to darshan psukim, in this case from Hosea Novi, to indicate this metaphor of Klal Yisrael as a married woman. Dvar Hashem asher hayol Hosea b'mei Uzziah Yosam achaz Yechizkiah Malchei Yehuda. The pasuk introduces Hosea, the very first pasuk of Sefer Hosea, as prophesizing during the kingships of 4 different kings. And the Gemara wants to know, why did the Torah go out of its way to mention 4 different kings? And the answer is, says the Gemara, "Beperek echad nisnabu arba neviim." There were four great prophets who were almost contemporaries of Hoshea. They spanned these four kingships. And Gadol shebekulam Hoshea. And the greatest of all these Nevi'im was Hoshea. So who are these four Nevi'im? First of all, we have Micha, and he was at the time of Melech Uzziah. Then we have Yeshaya Hanavi. He was at the time of Yosam, and then we have Amos and Hosea. In any event, the greatest of all these four Nevi'im, and they're outstanding Nevi'im, is Hosea. Gadol Shebekulam, the greatest of all of them was Hosea. Shenemar Tchilas Diber Hashem Hosea, which literally translates as Hashem spoke first with Hosea. And that's not historically or chronologically accurate. So what does it mean God spoke first amongst these four Nevi'im to Hosea? Bechiba Hosea Dibra Tchila? Is that what it really means? Halo Moshe ad Hosea Kama Nevi'im. There were so many Nevi'im, so what does it mean God spoke first to Hosea? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Chil Li'arba Nevi'im Shenitznavu Boso Perek, Elohen Hosea, Yeshaya, Amos, and Micha. Amongst these four Nevi'im that lived in that era, in that period of time, Hosea is considered the greatest. So now at this point in the Agadah, the Gemara goes back to the beginning of Sefer Hosea to describe the dialogue between Hashem and Hosea. And it's pretty harsh. It's pretty scary, because what Chazal are saying, and it's all based on a pasuk at the beginning of Hosea that we're going to learn, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes down very hard on Hosea. Hosea made one major blunder, as great of a prophet as he was. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo Hosea banecha chatu. Now it's true that the children of Israel were guilty of sin at the time of Hosea, very severe sins, but nevertheless, hoya lo lomar, you should have responded, banechahem. Hashem, these are your children. B'nei chanunechahem. These are your favorite ones. Chanun. B'nei Avram v'Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Al gel rachamecha aleim. Hosea, you should have prayed for divine compassion, divine mercy. And that's not what Hosea did. Instead, lo dayo shelo amar kach. Bad enough that Hosea did not pray to try to stave off any decree against the sinners of Israel. Ela amar lefanov, he said to God, and again, this is all Torah Shval Peh based on one pasuk in Hosea, which we'll see has a very loose connection to this. But Chazal say, Ribono shel olam, Hosea is so frustrated with the people of Israel, and he cannot have an impact on them, but he turns to the master of the universe and he says, Kol ha'olam shalcho. Everything is in your power. Havireim ba'uma acheres. Give them up, exchange them, pick up another nation. Maybe there's another nation that could be your chosen people. Imagine a Navi who was so despondent and he had such despair over the possibility that he felt that the Jewish people had crossed all red lines. They were guilty of the most severe sins. And he lifts his hand to Ribono Shel Olam, says, Ribono Shel Olam, why don't you just dump them and just replace them with another nation? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ma eseh lezaken zeh. What am I going to do with this man? In other words, can I find some sort of an excuse for the way he's speaking, the way he's behaving? Maybe because he's old. Omar lo, and this is where that pasuk that I indicated before will be quoted. God says to Hosea, we'll see the pasuk in just a minute, Lech v'kach isha zona v'holed lecha banim zunim. You should marry a zona and have children out of marriage. Now, this gigantic machlokus here as to whether or not this actually was the command of God, and Hosea married such a woman. The psukim seem to indicate that he did, but some say this is all part of a vision that he had, and God was giving him a musashmuz through this vision. He says, could again, and going according to that shot that it's a vision, God says to Hosea, go and marry this woman, have children. Now I'm going to tell you, divorce her. Will you have the cruelty, so to speak, to terminate that relationship? Here's a woman that you took in and you had children with her. Now you're going to divorce her? And if a woman that you took and she's a zona, you still have these inhibitions and you shy away from giving her a divorce, how much more so if she was your wife? We have a marriage relationship. You want me to divorce her? And where's the basis for Chazal coming up with this whole dialogue between the Almighty and Hosea? Where is it indicated in the Psukim? And at the beginning of Hosea, it says, Vayomer Hashem el Yoshua el Hosea, lech kach eshes nunim v'yaldes nunim. Go take for yourself a woman of harlotry and children of harlotry. And the Gemara now is going to talk about the next pasuk in Yeshaya, in Hosea. Uksiv vayelech vayikach is Gomer bas Dvolim. Again, assuming this is not a vision, it's a reality. He actually married a woman by the name of Gomer. Now, Gomer in Lashon Kodesh sounds Miloshin Gemar, to complete something. So the Gemara is going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what was the name of this zona that Hosea, but what was the meaning of that name? And not only that, the Torah, the Tanakh identifies her as the daughter of Dvolim, or Divlam, or Divloyim. I mean, different ways of pronouncing the word. Omar Rav. So Rav is the first of the Amoraim to come forward and darshan interpreting her name and her father's name. Gomer, Shakol Gomrim Ba. Gomrim Ba means that Rashi says they fulfill their desire by completing Bia with her. And why is she called Bas Volim? Now we turn to Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis. Is Dvolim Diba Ra Bas Diba Ra. Diba Ra means people spoke disparaging words against her, Diba Ra, because she was a Zona. And not only that, her mother apparently was suspect of being a Zona. And therefore, she is Dvolim Bas Diba Ra. Even her mother was of ill repute. And in a minute, we'll see Shmuel's interpretation of her name.